So welcome back. I think where we were, 3 or 4 weeks ago, is we were going through this document that we had written. We started to write when I was in Berlin for my 75th birthday, and people contributed to it. And we've been talking through what other people wrote, and then I put in here what I wrote. And there's probably not very much that's new because it's basically anything that I find really interesting I put into the workshop slides, and it's not even probably as good as the workshop slides, but it's topics that I just found so compelling that they made it into this document. So uh, if I think this is about where we left off. If anybody remembers it differently, tell me. But this whole idea of, which I think is really central to the 4D work, the idea of a social context field. And as I've said before, physicists were mostly talking and thinking in terms of forces until Einstein came along in 1915 with his general theory of relativity, where he explained probably one of the most mysterious things I've ever thought about, which is the gravitational field. And he named it as resulting from the curvature of space-time. And that's an interesting topic of itself. And so from that point on, physicists really thought in terms of fields more than in terms of forces. So I picked up that piece of the jargon and carried it here. And so the question is, if the really important thing about a field is you want to be able to measure it and manage it. In the case of gravitational fields, we measure them, but we don't really manage them except if we want to do, for example, an experiment where we bring two masses together and measure the force that way. In the case of electromagnetic fields, of course, we manage those with everything from power cables to transistors. But in the case of, so how would you do this invisible social field? How would you measure it and manage it? Because if you can't do that, I don't think the work's very interesting. So during workshops, I frequently take a imaginary heavy iron bar and hand it to somebody and say, could you tell if this is magnetized? And people reflect on that. And most of the time they say, no, I can't tell, which is the right answer. You can't tell. There's no way we don't have any magnetic sensors in our fingers. So I take it back and pretend it's really heavy and put it on the table. Then said, do you remember how you measured this when you were perhaps in grade school? And you put a piece of paper over the suspected magnetic bar, and you dropped iron filings on it, and you tapped it, and you could see the field lining up with the filings. And of course, magnetic fields are, I think, almost completely universally dipole fields. So you could see the pattern, you know it's a magnetic field, you name it. So how would you do this by analogy? How would you measure a social context field? What's the tracer particle? So I talked about this before, but I think my sense is you guys don't mind getting a review. I think if you were to imagine social contexts that many of us have been involved with, making or receiving a marriage proposal, having dinner with your fiance's family, or a bachelor or bachelorette party, or hijacking on your honeymoon, I think if I had, I think you would automatically and without any conscious thought change your behaviors to align with the social context field. At the bachelor party, you're going to be jovial and probably drinking. At the fiance's family meeting dinner, you're going to be minding your manners and so forth. And so I think if I were to put wouldn't take much except some fairly trivial sensors to measure just your body motions, I could probably tell which of these four fields you were in. So what this tells us is that behaviors are the tracer particles of the social context fields, and that makes total sense. How would you pick the behaviors? Well, some time ago, I fairly deep into the 4D work, I got interested in trying to see how the basic constructs I'd come up with would align with other more conventional ideas in psychology, and the obvious one being Maslow's needs hierarchy. So I applied this and I was quite surprised that in a sort of overall sense, the 4D process and the 4D requests align quite well with Maslow's needs. And I think there's disagreement among psychologists about what they exactly are. But I think the sense that appreciation and inclusion are deep human needs are quite prevalent. So we measure how people behave with regard to how they appreciate people, how they include people, and so forth. With a simple, and now the big question was, you got the phenomenon of normalization of deviance, which was what Diane Vaughan wrote about in her book about Challenger, where you have behaviors that become deviant in an absolute sense, but not noticed in the context of the social context field. And the idea here is to measure against a standard. So I wrote standards for each of the behaviors, and that's how we measure them. And then how do you manage them? You manage them by picking behaviors that are benchmarking lower relative to other behaviors and focusing on them. And the 8 behaviors that we use might appear to be very distinct things, but they're actually quite interrelated. For example, if you appreciate more effectively, everything else becomes easier to do and more natural. So that's really, I think, a very core idea in all this work. The idea of not just the field, but the idea you can measure it by measuring behaviors, and you can modify it by changing behaviors. And I like what Gandhi says about this. We must be the change we want to see in the world. And by simply doing this, you begin to change everybody around you. So thoughts or questions or comments about this?
I'm glad you paused, Charlie. I did have a couple thoughts and maybe a question in here.
Yeah.
The avoidance of normalization of deviance, I think that is that's kind of the next key concept that I'm working to wrap my head around, and the identification of you called them standards. Is that, am I?
Yeah, so let's talk about normalization of deviance. It's really it's where I think it's a common occurrence. It's where a behavior that would someone from an external observer could look at this and say, "What you're doing is crazy."
Yeah.
But in the social field that you're immersed in, the fish can't see the water, this kind of thing.
Yep.
And so, how do you make a measurement? And if you ask people simply comment on the behavior, that they can't talk about what they can't see, so they're not going to know it. But if you make a standard, and for example, for appreciation, the standard is HAPS. Is it, do you appreciate habitually, authentically, specifically, promptly, and so forth? So that's an idea that I got from a workshop participant. Actually, it didn't occur to me. Someone else mentioned it. I thought that's it. So that's in terms of the system, the standard tries to lift up the veil of the normalization of deviance and take you back to what would be reasonable people would see as how to behave. You know, again, fish can't see the water is kind of a good metaphor for that.
Right.
You know, and I think what takes people there is some kind of a insistence by authority figures. I think the whole Republican Party is in normalization of deviance right now, for example.
Yep. Yep.
And so you get some kind of abnormal, you know, we are arguably the most social animal. I think you could say, you know, bees are social, ants are social, but we are more socially adaptable than any other animal, I think. And I think that trying to explain things like how we annihilated the Neanderthals after we had sex with them and they were stronger and smarter, our social abilities. I think with humans, the kind of thinking is if we found a better arrowhead, everybody shared the story quickly and everybody used a better arrowhead. And so the
Right.
same thing that created our evolutionary advantage to survive Neanderthals being just an interesting case study in this, is our social behaviors. And of course, you can see it everywhere. You go to a sporting event, or how people get so wrapped up in cheering for a soccer team or a football team, and we are social. It's so I think the social context field, to be able to actually measure it by putting standards for behaviors against it and saying, is this how you're behaving, is just a really powerful notion in this work.
Real quick question. In your experience with the team development accelerator process, does it take much explanation or introduction in getting people to kind of level set on the standard, or in your experience, has it been pretty self-explanatory?
No, you don't. I think the standards. I think the standards quite self-explanatory.
Okay,
I think the way I do this is I've done the measurement with people that had very little knowledge of what we were doing. Usually, I try. The crucial thing is to recognize the central role of authority figures in all this, and that's typically a team leader, supervisor. But there's also people who have a lot of influence, particularly in technical organizations, but their technical abilities, people listen to them, or some people by virtue of personality. So if the leader doesn't buy into this, you're not going anywhere. But once you get that, all they've got to do is say, we're going to do this thing. And the TDA thing is completely self-explanatory. I don't think anybody has to understand anything about the whole system to make the measurement.
So the real hurdle is getting the buy-in to get
From the leader. Yep, that's
Yep.
the real hurdle.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Because if they don't want to do it, it's not going to go anywhere. We're not, the two big forces here are the social context field set by the leader, and you can just, I mean, you can look at the US politics and look at the social context field that Trump sets versus the one Biden sets, and you can see the whole government, everybody under them changing with it. The people they put in power, how they do this.
Right.
So they got to buy in, and they got to believe. So so the way I would typically do this is I make a sort of a 1 hour briefing, either on the phone or in person. Zoom wasn't as common when I was doing this work. We had it, but it wasn't used the way it is today. And take them through it. And in the early days, before I had the book or anything, I'd get pushback from the technical people, the blues. And they would say, well, I don't know if we believe you. And I would say, that's a really rational thought, because nothing else works. And you've been hoodwinked with this nonsense for years and years and years. Do these things and nothing changes. So I could try and convince you for another 2 hours, or you can just go use this online tool and benchmark your performance. So I used some misdirection. I changed the subject from development to how would you like to benchmark your team performance. And the people, well, I like working with the supervisor level at the sort of mid-management, because these are sort of the master sergeants of the workplace. The top management is in a different space. These are the people who are going to make or break their careers on how their team does. So they're interested in this. And then once they see that, the real aha, I think, for them is when they see that the act of doing this provides what some people call action learning, provides data they can use for some useful purpose. They're bought in. The other obstacle you have is that in big organizations, HR comes up with these annual assessments, typically 60, 80 questions. And NASA does it. I looked at them and said, this is a bunch of nonsense. You don't, you get data that's interesting to management. And usually I could tell exactly what's going to happen, because I know what's going on in different parts of the agency. And so when the thing people have to get is that this whole process is, and this is a hard mindset shift, is a developmental one. We're not used to taking exams, and this looks like a test. Not used to taking exams for developmental purposes. We're much more familiar with taking exams for scoring purposes. And if you look at it that way, it won't work because people will fake the data to make themselves look good. So you've got to convince people that this is information only for them. People have used this for evaluative purposes, and I said, if you want to do that, take my name off it. We don't do that. So it's I think I'm glad you asked about the tool, because I think it's probably the most interesting thing in the whole work. People really much more focus on the colors and the personality part, and that's interesting. But this is the core, the idea of the social context field affecting behaviors. Behaviors affect performance. Behaviors affect how people grow in the field or don't. It's just central.
Thank you.
Larisa, Darinka, thoughts, comments?
Um, I thought a lot over the years about normalization of deviance, and I would, yeah, and I would like to believe that collective actions of members of the team still have some positive effect on that process, regardless of even if the leader does not really buying into it, it still matters what other team members think. Maybe they step up uh, in terms of they, I don't know,
No,
leadership.
I completely agree. It's that's why I think of the TDA tool is the most potent, because it's measuring the behavioral norms of the group,
Yeah,
and that's everything. Okay, all I'm saying is that what if the leaders have a clear role in influencing that, but ultimately how the group behaves, because they interact together all the time. That there's a bigger social interaction typically between members of the team, especially my work is mostly, not entirely, mostly with technical teams. And of course, engineers and scientists, engineers more so, are working collectively,
yeah,
especially complex systems like space systems. The success requires the collective behaviors. Everyone, the system doesn't work if the thermal system doesn't work or the electrical system doesn't work. So how people behave towards each other is the most important thing, and how that proceeds has a lot to do with the team leader. I mean, I've watched one person take a project and turn it around from failing to becoming successful by just the behaviors that they support, and we tend to mimic the team leader's behaviors. I watched NASA. We got a new administrator came in who was more of like a Trumpian approach to things, and overnight, how the management talked to each other was different.
yeah. I guess would you name the fact that the leader in certain cases is himself or herself is having a behavioral issues, which is an attempt to normalize the deviance, so to speak. Is that the extreme case scenario?
I think the two ideas are not so connected. The normalization of deviance certainly can be driven by. Well, let's go to the 737 Max story. Okay,
Yeah,
I think that's a case where the CEO of Boeing uh, caused normalization of deviance throughout the whole organization. And
yeah,
my version of this is that when Airbus came out with the Neo 15% improvement in efficiency, that he said, don't worry about it, because our customers will always go with Boeing. And next thing, a year later, he gets a phone call from the head of American Airlines that says, our next order is going to be half 737s and half Neos, or I guess maybe all Neos. I've forgotten exactly. And the guy gets into a panic and says, how about if we make the 737 the same efficiency? And the guy says, yeah, if you can do it and meet the schedule, we need these on schedule. So he commits to doing something that's basically impossible, and now directs everybody to do it. And I suspect that it's an environment where if you say we can't do it, you're going to be gone. So that's a clear case where I think the leader himself drove the normalization of deviance. I think with Challenger, it's much more collective because the problem was shared by, I mean, what I believe is the core issue with Challenger was the fact that the space shuttle was sold on a lie, that it was going to be cheap access to space. And when it became obvious that it was a lie to everybody who thought about it, the whole group sort of joined in on that one. So I think, but I think the fact that people's got this warped view of reality is the essence of the problem. Does that make sense?
Does, yeah. It sounds still very challenging, to say the least. Yeah.
It's back to addressing unfortunate realities, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, this shortfall in humans just strikes me as so amazing. The fact that if people simply had addressed the unfortunate reality, the shuttle was never going to be a cheap access to space and done early, you probably would have. I think what really amped the whole problem up was when the administrator Jim Beggs got Reagan to make it the National Space Transportation Vehicle, and the reason he did that was, I mean, it's an old trite expression, but he's losing money on every flight and tried to make it up on volume, and
Yeah.
and compounded the error with good intentions.
Yeah. Thank you, Charlie.
I think this is a template to understand a lot of things, is what I'm saying.
No, absolutely.
And
It's also, Charlie, for me, it's well, when we look into an entity, when we need to do an assessment of an entity, one of the first things that you think about is we call it tone at the top.
yep,
So-
that's another term for it. Yep, that's
Yeah,
it.
So that's, but you know what, my thinking is, why do people do it? Because perhaps there is a number of cases when at the top they direct the organization to do something crazy like that, which is near impossible, and then it gets done.
Yeah,
So to me, I'm always thinking, like, what is the motivation? Why do they think that it can be done? They must be looking into those scenarios where to them seemingly it was done and it promoted those individuals personally. There's always, in my mind, there's always that personal interest in, okay, that person saying, look, I've done impossible.
I think you hit the nail on the head. It's in their personal interest. So he's probably, I don't know, I'm speculating, he's thinking, wait a minute, if the board of directors finds out that we're losing market share to Airbus en masse, they're gonna probably fire me.
Yeah.
And so I gotta fix this. And rather than say, boy, I made a terrible mistake, instead we're gonna bully our way through it. Isn't this kind of what's going on?
Yep.
I think it's interesting to think about selfishness. And selfishness, I think, has a good side to it, but it has overdone, has a bad side to it. So I think I could look at the Supreme Court decision on abortion. Looks to me like that was crazy, to my viewpoint. You can just political choices every day look to me like, what are they thinking? So I don't know. It's we're a defective animal. Well, let me back it up. We're an animal is the first thing to recognize. And filling our bellies is number one job, whether it's the next meal or the bank account.
Looks like Nate has a question. He raised his
But-
hand.
We're at 9:30, my mountain time,
On
so
our feet.
30 minutes.
Oh, okay.
Phew. I think I ate too much over the holidays. Okay, next topic. Are we good to move on?
I think so.
Well, the Chinese are interesting people for workshops because they're less they engage more than Western audiences do. They're willing to ask me questions that I think Westerners are embarrassed to ask, but maybe people are thinking about. And very often they say, you know, what's the magic fix? How can what can I do to become a more effective leader? What's the trick? And I love these kind of questions. In fact, one of the things I really enjoyed with them is that we had lots and lots of dialogue with the participants that I found interesting. And so my answer is that you've got to do the work. And Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book called Outliers. All of his books are mistitled. They should be the Power of Social Context 1, the Power of Social Context 2, the Power of Social Context 3. And what he points out is that if Bill Gates had been born, for example, plus or minus 5 years differently, you'd never have heard of him. He was just at the right moment when computers were coming together where you could make a living selling software that made computers work. The same thing with, he argues with the Apple guy, on and on and on, or even investors or people who got very wealthy. And so he says that it takes 10,000 hours to master anything. And what's interesting about that is that I watch people come into senior management jobs at NASA. The most prominent case is astronauts who have no management experience, and watch them bungle being head of NASA for about 4 years. About the time they're learning how to do it, they're leaving. The same, I think, with some presidents. They come in there without any management experience. I think Obama's a prime example. And in this was basically a CEO's job at the biggest company in the world. And about the time they're leaving, they're getting the hang of it. So, and then I'm always looking for ways to put more women in things because we live in a very misogynistic society. This Laura Board, I have a video clip of her. The first lesson is the primary driver of changing your brain is your behavior. There's no drug you can take. Nothing is more effective than practice. Increased difficulty, increased struggle actually leads to more learning and greater structural change in the brain. And when I was an undergraduate and physicist, we said things like, you don't learn anything from a problem you can do, which means unless you struggle, you don't get it. So the answer is there is no shortcut to be more effective. I think you've got to do the work. Thoughts, comments?
You gotta do the work. Yeah, that's the bottom line.
You got to do the work. You know,
Yep.
it took me a long time to kind of get this. You got to do the problems. You know, physics would be easy without problems. I believe it or not, there are physics problems that as an undergraduate, I could spend 6 hours on a thing that was defined in 4 sentences and not get it. And so, you know, this is another thing. Most people, don't you think most people believe there's some easy trick without doing the work? What do you think?
No, I believe in hard work, and also oftentimes when you see those that there's a promotion and someone with complete lack of experience or knowledge or gets promoted, it can happen and it might work for a period of time,
Yeah,
but inevitably there are unfortunate events down the line. The only question is, what do you personally do? How do you behave when you get a leader like that, who now determines your destiny? What do you do? I mean, that it becomes really, really tough.
yeah, I think, that's when I was working as a consultant, that's an issue people frequently confronted me with. And I said, sometimes you just got to move on.
No.
Like Nat said at the start of this, at some point, I like the expression that's in the too hard category. So you just move on. I got that from a client when I was consulting. This is in the too hard category. I like that expression. And another thing that came up about this was people who had these dysfunctional styles, and people say, look at him, he's very successful. I said, just wait, okay? It catches up with you. The basics are there. Excuse me, I got a service call here. Hang on. Hello.
Good morning, Charlie. It's Angelique.
Hi.
Charlie, you need to go on mute.
John is out today.
Oh,
Get that work for you.
sure.
Next Thursday, right now, it's down for his.
Let me take a look here. Hang on. I'm actually recording a webinar at the moment, but no. It's, let me get the calendar up here. Yeah, Thursday 1 to 4 works.
Perfect. All right, Charlie.
Thank you. Take care. Have a good day. Bye-bye. Yeah, I couldn't find the mute button on this little icon anyway, so the guy is supposed to come fix our mini splits out sick today, so anyway, that's it. Okay, so are we sort of finished with this topic? Good. This was a story that I tell as though it was me, but it's to be full disclosure, it might be that this happened with Frank and he told me about it. I was doing workshops at Marshall at the time, so I just tell it like it's mine because it's simpler. But we had probably the greatest project manager living at Marshall Space Flight Center. He managed the external tank and then Hubble telescope. I knew him really well. Jim Odum's his name, and he was famous at that center. He became our 4D manager there. So because of his reputation and anything that he bought into, and he loved his work, we did more work there than any place else. And you may remember the chart I showed of this, where the change in Marshall's behaviors over time was twice as fast as any place else in NASA. But this little anecdote about a guy who this impressed me. Doing a workshop, a guy leaped to his feet and said, I've worked in this place for 20 years and never looked forward to coming to work. Then I went away for 18 months and returned to a completely different place. I was mystified about this until I attended this workshop. And you've used 4D to change the social context of the whole engineering division. And the reason was that the director, a guy named Rudy Rodolfi, he's got 1,000 people working for him. And he did a workshop and bought into this, back to the idea of leaders' endorsement and buying in. So they couldn't get enough of this. And how good evidence for how differently things can be over a relatively short period when people do this. And Frank did most, after a while, I quit doing these workshops here because these are not my people. They're Frank's people. They're into Auburn football, and buying a bottle of wine is like being a heroin dealer down there. So Frank went down there and did these after a while. But that's just one of my favorite little stories. And the Marshall has this very strange culture that comes from the fact that von Braun and the Germans ran the place at the start. I think if they'd done this work earlier, we probably could have prevented both Challenger's explosion and Hubble's mirror flaw, because they would have treated the contractors differently than they did. So, thoughts, comments? So this is about the potency of this to change places en masse. And no example was more profound than Marshall. Good, move on.
Good, thank you.
And this is, I don't have the graph here, but we talked about changing the whole agency. Unless you got, I think you may remember this graph that showed Marshall changing twice as rapidly as everybody else, and exactly with twice as many workshops per unit employee as the rest. So it suggested a linear relationship between the number of workshops you do. And of course, they're doing IDAs and TDAs with them. So the workshops are just an easy measurement of how much work we're doing. But it's really more than the workshops are I don't think as important as the online tools, as I talked about before. This was a surprise to find out the online tool was creating more behavioral change than the workshop. But the reason is because it's easy repetition. Again, I don't think you change behaviors without repetition any more than you learn without doing the problems. It's the same idea. Engagement in the material. Make sense?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think kind of circling back on our previous thought, and then hopefully closing a loop on this one. Practice is how we, practice and behavior change is how we make improvements. Having a way to measure it, which this tool does, is certainly in my personal experience, one of the best ways to just kind of get that feedback loop moving in a positive direction.
Yeah, for sure. Thoughts, comments, move on.
It's an amazing result on 20,000 employees.
Yeah. I agree. This was just really rewarding. This is an interesting idea. I got interested in various kinds of psychological things, and I think to be honest about it, the main thing that propelled me into this was a very painful divorce, which I didn't imagine would be as traumatic as it turned out to be. I instigated it and wanted it, but as I started off with going with a psychologist doing talk therapy, and discovered that these people, the ones I interacted with, they were crazier than I was, and this was not useful at all. So I began sort of taking courses with various people, and there were people that would come to Washington and do a weekend seminar or something, and I was in circles where I found out about these. But I hooked up with a group that was based in Colorado Springs, a husband and wife team, about somatic psychology, and they had a so-called certification program that required going to their classes for, I've forgotten now exactly, but I think a week-long event and then several weekends. And they were interesting people, so I went and did their course. I did this, I think, when I was at CU.
Is this the Hendrix?
Yeah, Hendricks, Gay and Catherine Hendricks.
Yep, okay,
Um,
I remember, yep.
So, but one of the things that was interesting was the idea that emotions are body sensations. The somatic psychology this is the core idea. And that was an odd notion at first, that's what emotions are, because you don't experience them that way. But what they taught was that they occur in very specific locations on the body. And as I began to practice with this, I confirmed my experience was like that. And that's the reason emotions are so powerful, because emotions are occurring in major parts of your body. And of course, there's lots and lots of neurons in our guts and other places on our body than our brains. And the thinking is our little baby blanket size cerebral cortex. So the idea was the emotions are powerful because they're coming from a big mass of your body. And so this was an idea that was interesting to me because it was really different. So they talked about the fact that you feel stress and anxiety in your chest, and I think that I could experience that. Then I found this research paper, and it was in the Academy of Sciences. So this is not online nonsense. When you publish with a journal like this, it makes a lot of impression on me. And these were Scandinavian researchers, and they took these blank drawings of people, and they went and did this with hundreds of people in multiple countries. And they asked them to color in with increasingly bright colors where the emotions showed up. And so this was the first kind of scientific documentation of this idea that at first was very odd, and then kind of confirmed with my own experience that this is a correct idea. And you can see here that glad lights up almost everything. Mad mostly lights up our arms, which makes sense for getting ready to fight. I couldn't find sad, but I found depression, and it's not much energy anywhere, which I think is right. Scared is in here in the same area. And then love lights up most. And I had an experience again when I was at CU. A good friend of mine from NASA took a big job at Lockheed Martin, and he and I would get together and talk. And he had a brain cancer problem, had some surgeries. And I said, what was the worst part of it? He said, it wasn't the pain. It's what most people think. It was the lack of energy. He said I had to sit in the chair and think about for 20 minutes how I'm going to get the energy to stand up. And so I started thinking about how crucial our life energy is. In Japan, they ask you, "Genki desu ka?" How's your life energy? Which is a sensible thing. And how these diagrams relate to your life energy. So deciding to live in glad and love has a benefit, I think, that's not talked about too much in terms of enhancing your life energy. And so as you get older and think about keeping your life energy going, this is the methodology to do it, to live in appreciation, which is love and glad both, or you could say gratitude and appreciation together, the mindset and the behavior. And the benefit is it lifts your life energy. Thoughts, comments? You can choose where your attention
Yeah.
goes. You can
I
choose
would
your
love to make a
mindset with your
comment.
storylines, and you can manage your life energy.
I would love to make a comment here. It's very strongly related to kinesiology and then also brain gym. And I actually just looked at the book Smart Brevity. I don't know if you've know about it, but they've got this program Axios HQ. But it's all based on effective communication, and by just pointing out to one emoji, it captures, a lot of words in trying to describe emotions. So it's actually a smart way of communicating to yourself without words, using symbolic language. So I do have a lot of attraction to this whole section. Yeah.
Good. Well, I think, you know, there's always more complicated ways of thinking about these things, but I find focusing on this really simple notion is most effective for me. And I try not to distract myself into too many alternate theories of this stuff. Maybe that's a failing, but that's how I do it. Stick with this basic central idea that you can choose your storylines, manage your emotions, and pick them so that they take you into these two places, and that's enough. But thank you anyway, Nico. Makes sense? Good? Okay. So this is people ask me about case studies, and the team was in real trouble. Everybody's miserable. And I found that they're in the bottom quintile with the TDA. And early on, of course, we learned that how to do this is you show the manager the 7 deadly sins. And the first one is that you're the problem. So I put that down and the paper down and said, you know, are you the problem? And I think what's interesting is when I worked as a manager, people would not, I would not, and they would not be willing to have this conversation because it's dangerous. Once I was an outside observer or consultant trying to help them, they weren't afraid of this. And several times someone said, yeah, I might be. So the way to do this is to run an IDA and let's see how people see the team leaders' behaviors. We did, and it was a disaster. And I said, okay, now what's going on? And she said, I really don't like this job. I don't like working with people. They put me in here because I'm excellent technically. And that's a common problem in technical organizations. I just said, this is not going to end well. I mean, there's the project's not doing well. And if you're unsuited to this work, there's not going to be a happy ending here. So how about you and I go talk to the director of projects and see if we can get, I knew him quite well. He was a good guy and a caring person, put you back in a technical job in a way that preserves your dignity. In other words, to move her back into something in her comfort zone and do it in a way that didn't embarrass her and get a replacement who's, this is a Jet Propulsion Lab. They had plenty of good project managers there. And that's exactly what we did. Went to his office, explained the situation, how the process worked. And he said, okay. So she held her status, held her salary and got a different person in here, and the project changed immediately. So just kind of and this happened. I did this probably 3 or 4 times in the process of the 10 years doing this work. I also had the inverse situation. I had a project at a contractor where the vice president knew me. He moved to that company from a different company. He knew me from before. He said, I need you to help me fire this project manager. And I said, well, let's go see what's going on. So I did a TDA, and the team was in the bottom quintile, bad. And then I did an ID. I did the work around the 7 deadly sins, and I knew a few people on the team. Asked them, is this guy the problem? And they said, no, he's a good manager. We like him. So I did an IDA on him, and it turned out to be a good result. I went back to the vice president and said, I'm not going to help you fire this guy. He's not the problem. You may not like him, but he's not your trouble. So I got the team in the room together with me and went down the list and said, what's the problem here? And what the problem was, was that they had, there was a new customer classified program, and they had lowballed the bid, which is not unusual in aerospace companies. But the vice president who was trying to get me to fire the program manager had cut the bid back even farther, so he was the culpable party. And what he had done is he had projected his own self-anger, this is the blamer state, onto the project manager, but he's the one that had them buy into a job that was impossible. And I said, so the only right thing to do now is to go tell the customer the truth, that you made a lowball bid. It wasn't, government kind of expects that. We put reserves to manage that. Usually the biggest impact is you get less profit because in a cost plus contract, the profit you get is based on your original bid, not the ultimate cost of the project. But in some cases, their companies are willing to do that because it gets a new market or gets them some experience they want. But what you've got here is unobtainium. You cannot do this. And they said, what should we do? I said, you should go make a 4D request to the customer, tell them the truth, address the unfortunate reality. This job cannot be done within a factor of 2 of the money that they've got. And either they should terminate it or come up with the money or change the scope. And so what if they want to just terminate it? So, well, then you're better off, cutting your losses. And again, it's back to the too hard category. Just go do something else. And he said, well, I'm not going to do that. I said, okay, it's your choice. And he was gone in 6 months. The company fired him. The vice president, not the project manager. So I think it's interesting to use these diagnostic tools for real world problems, and they work. Thoughts, comments?
Thank you for sharing the real life examples. It really serves as a good illustration how it can be done and how it was done.
Yeah, it's real stuff, Larissa. It's the project is called Stereo. Actually the bigger story is the project manager, the deputy project manager stayed throughout, and he became more of the 4D advocate, but the new project manager and I got along really well. And because the deputy was kind of the impetus, they stayed with this. And they transitioned over like a 18-month period. Every TDA score went up. They got into the green, from the red to the green quintile in 18 months. And before they had been, so I've had lots of contacts in NASA headquarters, which is sort of the oversight group for this kind of thing. This is the field center team I'm working with. And the project went from being kind of the doormat of the Office of Space Science into the model of managerial excellence. And this 2 or 3 times. So I thought what was important for me about these experiences is that I saw the people's impression within the project, the people's experience working there, the way other people named the activity changed right along with the scores. And that gave me great confidence the scores are doing real world measurements. I'm just noticing I've hit 10 o'clock. So time to pause for today. We got time for another minute worth of comments or questions.
Thank you, Charlie,
Yeah.
for sharing these.
Yes, thank you. Nothing from my end.
Thank you,
Nico?
Charlie.
Thank you from my
Nico?
side. Yeah, thank you very much. I'm just running here. It's like late afternoon. It's grandchildren taken care of and dogs and stuff. So
Okay.
I'm not going to even go into it. But glad to join you. See you guys.
Thank you all.
Great to see you too,
Good
Nico.
to see you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye bye.
See you next week.
Cheerio.
Next week. Bye bye.